Welcome, my friends. Today, let me take you into the story of a woman whose name still shines in every corner of the world. She was called the People's Princess. But before the fame, before the cameras, before the fairy tale wedding watched by billions, there was simply a girl named Diana Frances Spencer. Diana was born on July 1st, 1961 in Norfolk, England. Her family belonged to British nobility. She grew up in the large country estate of Park House, surrounded by history and tradition. From the very beginning, her life seemed connected to royalty. In fact, her family had long ties with the royal family. And young Diana often played with the Queen's children at Sandringham. But her childhood was not the fairy tale you might imagine. When she was only 7 years old, her parents' marriage ended in divorce. The house that once echoed with laughter suddenly felt divided. Little Diana was left with a broken heart, moving between her mother and father. That early pain carved something deep inside her, a sensitivity to suffering, and empathy for others, especially children. Even as a child, Diana was different. She had sparkling blue eyes and a shy smile. People said her presence could warm a room. But she was not loud or showy. She was gentle. She loved animals. She loved children, and she dreamed of being a ballet dancer one day. When she put on her ballet shoes, she felt free, graceful, almost like flying. At school, however, she was not the top student. Diana often struggled with her grades, but she had something much more powerful than academic success. She had heart. Teachers noticed that she was caring, always ready to help classmates who felt lonely. Her friends remembered her kindness more than her marks, and Diana herself once said, "I lead from the heart, not the head." During her teenage years, Diana's compassion began to shine even brighter. She worked as a nanny, caring for children in her neighborhood. She helped at a kindergarten, playing with the little ones, teaching them songs and games. She found joy in giving, and the children adored her. She was still shy, but inside she was beginning to discover her gift, the gift of touching hearts. Fate, however, was preparing something much bigger for her. In 1977, when Diana was just 16, she met Prince Charles. He was already a man in his late 20s, the heir to the British throne. At first, it seemed like a distant connection, a teenager meeting a royal. But Charles noticed something about her. She was genuine, unpretentious, and refreshingly natural in a world full of formality. And for Diana, the meeting planted a seed that would soon grow into a story the whole world would watch. By the time Diana was 19, their relationship had become the subject of whispers. The media started to follow her everywhere. Paparazzi crowded the streets, snapping photos whenever she stepped outside. Imagine a young woman, barely out of school, suddenly chased by cameras each day. It was overwhelming, and yet she tried to remain graceful. The world saw not just her beauty, but her innocence and charm. And soon, people began to fall in love with her. Then came the day that changed her life forever. Prince Charles asked Diana to marry him, and she said yes. News exploded across the globe. The shy young woman, once a kindergarten assistant, was about to marry the future King of England. The fairy tale was beginning, or so it seemed. On July 29, 1981, the wedding took place at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. It was called the Wedding of the Century. More than 750 million people watched on television. The streets of London overflowed with cheering crowds, and when Diana stepped out of her carriage, wearing a gown with a 25-foot train, the world gasped. She looked like a princess from a dream, graceful, radiant, and almost unreal. The cameras flashed, the bells rang, the music soared. For a moment, the entire world seemed to pause, holding its breath, celebrating this young bride. Little girls dreamed of being like her. Grown men and women were moved by her elegance. It was as if love itself had stepped onto the world stage. But what did Diana feel inside? Behind the glowing smile, her heart carried both excitement and fear. She dreamed of love and happiness, of a family where warmth would heal the scars of her childhood. She hoped to be more than a royal figure. She wanted to use her position to serve others, to bring light where there was darkness. She once said, "I knew my role was to love people and to use my heart." Soon after the wedding, the fairy tale seemed complete with the arrival of her first son. In 1982, Diana gave birth to Prince William. Her joy was indescribable. For her, motherhood was the purest form of love. She wanted William to grow up not only as a prince, but also as a child who knew kindness and compassion. 2 years later, in 1984, Prince Harry was born. Once again, Diana's heart overflowed. She dedicated herself to her children, determined to give them as normal a childhood as possible, despite the pressures of palace life. Yet even in these happy times, cracks began to appear. Life inside the palace was not as magical as it looked on television. The expectations, the strict rules, and the constant presence of the media weighed heavily on her. But Diana did what she always did. She smiled for the cameras, she loved her children deeply, and she gave hope to millions who saw her as more than a princess. She was already becoming something far greater, a symbol of compassion, a voice for the voiceless. And so Act 1 closes here, with Diana stepping into the spotlight of history. From a shy little girl to the most watched woman in the world, her journey had only begun. The crowds saw a princess, but the truth was more complex. Behind the glitter, behind the smiles, there was a woman searching for love, freedom, and purpose. And as the years unfolded, the world would see not just her struggles, but her incredible strength. So stay with me, my friends, because what comes next is not just a fairy tale, it is a story of courage, heartbreak, and transformation. A story that would make Diana not just a princess, but a legend. The fairy tale wedding had been celebrated across the globe. The world saw Diana as a shining star, the perfect princess in a sparkling gown. But once the applause faded, life inside the palace revealed its challenges. Behind the golden gates, the story was not as simple as it looked. From the very beginning, Diana faced enormous pressure. The media followed her every move, every dress, every smile, every glance became front-page news. She could not walk down a street, visit a shop, or spend time with her children without cameras flashing. Some days she felt like she was living in a glass box with no escape. At the same time, her marriage to Prince Charles began to show cracks. Charles was often distant, focused on his duties, and weighed down by expectations as the future king. Diana longed for closeness, for warmth and affection, but what she found instead was coldness and distance. The fairy tale started to feel like a cage. She once admitted, "There were 3 of us in this marriage." hinting at Charles's continuing relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. It was one of the most painful realities of her life. And yet, Diana kept her head high in public. She smiled for the crowds, waved to children, and gave people the feeling that she was truly present. She never let her personal pain stop her from showing kindness. But when the cameras were gone, she struggled. She felt lonely. She felt misunderstood. And in her private moments, she battled depression and despair. Still, Diana was not a woman who surrendered easily. Instead of letting the sadness define her, she decided to turn her energy towards something greater, helping others. This became her true purpose. She visited hospitals, spending hours at the bedside of sick patients. She comforted people with HIV and AIDS at a time when society was afraid to even touch them. When others stepped back in fear, Diana stepped forward with courage. One photo of her shaking hands with an AIDS patient changed the way the world looked at the disease. It told millions of people, compassion is stronger than fear. Her work with children also touched countless lives. She spent time at orphanages, hugged children with disabilities, and listened to their stories. She was not just a royal guest shaking hands politely. She sat on the floor with them, laughed with them, and let them know they were loved. People began to call her the People's Princess, not because of her crown, but because of her heart. But life inside the palace grew heavier. The constant tension in her marriage reached a breaking point. The media fueled the fire, reporting every rumor, every argument, every secret. By the early 1990s, it became clear that Diana and Charles could no longer continue as a couple. In 1992, they separated. And in 1996, the divorce was finalized. For Diana, the divorce was both painful and freeing. She had lost the title of Her Royal Highness, but she had gained something more precious, her independence. She was no longer trapped in the shadow of a broken marriage. She could now live life on her own terms, follow her own passions, and raise her children the way she wanted. As a single mother, Diana gave her whole heart to Prince William and Prince Harry. She took them on school runs, went to fast food restaurants with them, and showed them glimpses of a normal childhood. She wanted them to understand the world beyond the palace walls. She wanted them to see real life, not just the life of privilege. And because of her, the princes grew up grounded, compassionate, and aware of the struggles of ordinary people. But Diana's story was never just about being a mother or a princess. It was about being a voice for the voiceless. Her charity work expanded after the divorce. She campaigned against landmines, even walking through active minefields in Angola to show the danger faced by innocent children every day. The image of Diana in a simple white shirt and protective visor, walking calmly through danger, shocked the world. It was not an act of glamour. It was an act of courage. Her boldness made headlines, but it also saved lives. Governments began to take the issue of landmines seriously. The world started to listen. And once again, Diana proved that her influence was not about her beauty or title. It was about her heart and her bravery. Through all of this, Diana's relationship with the media remained complicated. The same cameras that spread her message of compassion also invaded her privacy. Paparazzi chased her day and night, often making her life unsafe. She longed for peace, yet her fame made it almost impossible to find. And yet, despite the pressure, She remained one of the most loved women in the world. Wherever she went, crowds gathered. People felt a personal connection to her. She spoke openly about her struggles with depression and eating disorders, subjects that were taboo at the time. Her honesty made her even more relatable. She showed that even a princess could feel pain, loneliness, and fear. And that vulnerability made her stronger in the eyes of millions. By the mid-1990s, Diana had become more than a royal figure. She was an international icon. Her style was copied. Her face was on magazines everywhere. But more importantly, her actions inspired hope. She had turned her personal pain into a mission to help the world. Still, behind the public image, Diana continued to search for peace. She wanted love, freedom, and a chance to live life fully. The media followed her relationships closely, often exaggerating or twisting details. But Diana's true focus never changed: her children and her humanitarian work. In many ways, the separation and divorce marked the beginning of a new Diana. No longer bound by palace restrictions, she became stronger, more independent, and even more determined to use her influence for good. She was learning to stand on her own, to speak in her own voice, and to shape her own legacy. And just as the world began to see this new chapter of Diana's life, fate prepared to test her once more. A storm was coming, a storm that would change everything, not only for Diana, but for the millions who loved her. So stay with me, because the next part of Diana's journey is filled with both triumph and tragedy. It is the chapter that would turn her into not only a princess, not only a humanitarian, but a legend whose story still echoes in every corner of the world. Diana's new life after the divorce was full of freedom, but also danger. She was no longer bound by the strict rules of palace life. She could choose her own clothes, her own causes, her own words. For the first time in years, she was free to be herself. And yet, that freedom came with a price. The media's attention grew even more intense. Every step she took, every friendship she formed, every place she traveled was followed by flashing cameras and endless headlines. Diana was still one of the most photographed women in the world, and that spotlight never dimmed. But Diana refused to let the pressure silence her. Instead, she poured her heart into her humanitarian work. She became a powerful advocate for children, for the sick, for the forgotten. She worked closely with charities supporting hospitals, homeless shelters, and mental health services. She traveled the world, raising awareness for causes others ignored. One of her most courageous acts came in 1997. In Angola, she walked through a live minefield, wearing a simple vest and protective helmet. The world watched in shock and admiration. This was not a staged photo. It was real risk, real danger. Her courage brought global attention to the deadly threat of landmines. Months later, world leaders began negotiating treaties to ban them. Diana's voice had made a difference. Her compassion also touched lives closer to home. She often visited hospitals in secret, without cameras, just to hold the hands of patients. She spent hours listening to people who felt invisible. For them, she was not a princess. She was simply Diana, a woman who cared. But while the world admired her, her personal life remained under constant scrutiny. The paparazzi followed her relentlessly. Crowds of photographers surrounded her car wherever she went. She longed for peace, but fame made it nearly impossible. During this time, Diana formed new friendships and relationships. The media speculated endlessly, turning her private life into tabloid stories. She wanted love, she wanted happiness, but what she found instead was endless intrusion. Still, she tried to focus on what mattered most, her sons. William and Harry were her anchor, her greatest joy, and her reason to keep going. She once said, "I live for my boys. I would be lost without them." By 1997, Diana had truly become an icon of compassion and courage. She was no longer defined by her title or her marriage. She was defined by her heart. People across the world saw her as proof that kindness could change lives. But then, tragedy struck. On the night of August 31st, 1997, Diana was in Paris. She and her companion, Dodi Fayed, were being chased by paparazzi as their car sped through a tunnel. Moments later, disaster struck. The car crashed. In an instant, the world was changed forever. When the news spread, shock turned into grief. Millions could not believe it. The people's princess was gone. She was only 36 years old. Across the world, people wept openly. Flowers and candles filled the streets outside Kensington Palace. Strangers hugged each other in sorrow. It felt as if the entire world had lost someone they knew personally. Diana had touched lives so deeply that her death felt like a wound in every heart. Her funeral, watched by millions around the globe, was one of the most emotional moments in modern history. Her brother, Earl Spencer, gave a moving speech, calling Diana the most hunted person of the modern age. Her two sons, William and Harry, walked behind her coffin, showing incredible courage, despite their heartbreak. It was a moment the world would never forget. But Diana's story did not end with her death. Her legacy lived on. Through her sons, through the charities she supported, through the millions of people she inspired, her spirit continued to shine. William and Harry grew up carrying her values: compassion, kindness, and courage. They continued her work in mental health, children's welfare, and humanitarian causes. They often speak of their mother, describing her warmth, her laughter, and the way she made them feel safe. Her influence shaped them into the men they are today. Diana's impact on the world was profound. She broke down barriers. She changed the way people thought about AIDS, about mental health, about the role of compassion in leadership. She showed that even in a world filled with power and privilege, kindness is the greatest force of all. Her story was not perfect. It was filled with struggles, heartbreak, and pain. But that is what made her real. And perhaps that is why she touched so many lives. She showed the world that even a princess could suffer and still rise with grace. Diana once said, "Carry out a random act of kindness with no expectation of reward, safe in the knowledge that one day someone might do the same for you." These words capture her spirit perfectly. She believed in small acts of love that could ripple out and change the world. Today, more than 25 years after her passing, Diana remains a symbol of love and courage. Her story continues to inspire new generations to live with compassion. Every time someone chooses kindness over judgment or courage over fear, her spirit lives on. And so, as we remember Princess Diana, we are reminded of this simple truth. Life is not measured by titles, wealth, or fame. It is measured by love, how much you give, how deeply you care, and how many lives you touch along the way. Diana gave the world her heart, and in return, the world will never forget her. So, my dear friends, as you reflect on Diana's journey, ask yourself, how can you live with more kindness? How can you turn your struggles into strength? And how can you, in your own way, shine a light that will never fade? Because the story of Diana teaches us that true greatness does not come from perfection. It comes from compassion. It comes from courage. And it comes from living with love. Thank you for listening to this incredible journey. If you found inspiration in Diana's story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs hope today. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and never stop believing in the power of kindness.